Hi, this is Claire Dunne on the 9th of May at Watkins Bookshop in London. So, hello everybody, thank you for coming. And I just thought I'd like to let you know first up that I actually come to Jung as an ordinary reading member of the public. I don't come from an analytical background and I'm not a Jungian either. So in the way of things, I have ended up writing a book on Jung, and I've just come over from Ireland, so it reminds me of a story, which is an actual true story that happened in Connemara, of an American who was talking to an old farmer over a gate in that wild and beautiful area. And after talking to him for a while, he said to him, "Have you lived here all your life?" And the little old fella said, "Oh, I don't know yet." So, like, there was somebody who knew about life unfolding, and I guess what I'm really trying to say is that life unfolded me to this particular stage, which I could never have dreamed of for myself. So, what brought me to Jung in the first place was reading his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, many years ago. And the two things that struck me at the time was a statement that he said very early in the book. He said, "The psyche is by nature religious." And I hadn't paid any attention to psychology up to that point, so that kind of got me in. And then he also talks in the book about personalities number 1 and number 2, which he had very decidedly marked in himself and which we all have to a degree. So personality number 2 is our natural selves with which we come into life. And personality number 1 is how we adapt to family, to our social scene, to the age in which we live. So it's our adapted self as against the natural self. So he had that clash of opposites very markedly inside himself. And I guess one of the things that really impresses me about Jung is that everything he has written, he has experienced himself first. And I always trust that in people because there's a kind of a ring of reality that goes with it. So I'm going to attempt now to give you a potted version of Jung's life, say up to a particular age, and then take a little bit forward in that. So he did say of himself, all I am and all I write are a unity. So one is the same as the other. So you find Jung being born in Keswell, in a very small village area in Switzerland, and he in 1875, and he was an only child for 9 years. His parents were loving parents, but his whole ambience was very restricted. They came out of a traditional, very traditional, narrow Christian background. Very theological. I think there were 6 theologians on his mother's side and 2 on his father's. Now, this was a man or a child who needed to live out a huge range of himself, and that form of religious life wasn't big enough for him. So as a small child, he started having big dreams, which frightened him no end, and he had nobody that he could talk to about them, because they wouldn't have understood what he was on about. And he didn't himself understand them for many years either. And yet he credited them with being the forerunners of his creative and his spiritual life. So they've actually influenced him all the way through. So he was an only child, and he was a loner. He played by himself. When he went to school, he started changing around the age of... he loved nature, by the way, and that's very important for Jung, because if anything, he was an earth-rooted and spiritually centered person. So he did have this large range to live in himself as well. And when he went to school, he started changing. He started adapting somewhat. And he said he lived on personality number 1 until about the age of 10, personality number 2 until about the age of 10, and from 10 to about 40 he lived on personality number 2. So this is the time when he's a student, he's at university, he qualifies as a teacher, he's very well appreciated as a scholar, and then he decided he was going to specialize in psychiatry. Psychiatry had no standing at that stage at all, so everybody was totally dismayed that this brilliant student was going to go for psychiatry as his specialization. Now, by that stage, he was also exhibiting personality things that had swings in them. He was both timid and very assertive. He had super confidence and no confidence at all. So that contrast, and everybody talks of him in terms of contrast. His son once called him maddening and marvellous. And he did say of himself once when he was about 50, he said, "Nobody who look at my corpse will think that this is a spiritual man. You know, my appearance and what I am inside are so different. I am a clash of opposites." So that's important to hold with them, because this is what comes out then in his psychology. So we now happen to being a young doctor in Switzerland, and he was impressed by the writings of Sigmund Freud, who had just released The Interpretation of Dreams. And Jung felt that this was going along the same way as his own ideas. So he contacted Freud and sent him a copy of one of his own writings, and formed a very close friendship with him over a period of about 7 years. By now, Jung was already married. He'd married Emma Rochenbach, and he'd started a family of 5 children, just to give you sort of a personal thing there. So the relationship with Freud, it's mostly by correspondence, but when they first met, they talked for 13 hours solid. And then they had this correspondence, which is extremely, it's of friends and colleagues. It's intimate, and it's wonderful literature, I have to tell you, apart from anything else from the two of them. They were both great writers. I've actually done a program on Freud as well, and they both had later things that were given to them because of their literary skills, honours that were given to them, as well as various things to do with their straight profession. So the relationship with Freud developed. He was the older man. He was 19 years older. He was like a mentor, and Jung was his son and chosen son and successor. However, somewhere along the way, Jung started having these dreams again that he didn't quite understand, and he began coming up with ideas that were at variance and not acceptable to Freud. So the relationship soured, and it broke completely in 1913. Now that gets Jung up to about the age of 38 in a few minutes. So what happened now, it's from now on, this is the Jung that we mostly connect with, is the Jung that lived from then on. And what happened to him after the relationship with Freud broke up? By then he was an international figure in the psychiatric movement, which was a burgeoning movement at that time started by Freud. And this set out ideas that were directly contrary to Freud's. So everything disappeared at this point from his outer life. His colleagues dropped away. He was dismissed as a mystic. He was he resigned all his public posts, and he just kept his private practice, and of course he had his family. So he was in a period of suspension at this stage. He didn't know where he was, having these dreams, didn't know where he was going, what was happening. And then he was on a train in September 1913, and he had a living vision of Europe in complete disorder, disarray, blood pouring everywhere. It was a destructive picture of Europe that formed itself in his mind, and he thought he had gone mad. He said, I thought my mind had gone mad. So this was repeated several times, really to impress it upon him, and there was a voice saying, look at it closely, this will happen. You know, do not doubt it. And this started a whole period of inner fantasies. It was like his outer life had stopped and his inner life opened. And it opened into a series of dreams and fantasies and people who were appearing to him in dreams. He was having conversations with them all the time, recognizing that he could be going into territory where some of his patients had gone, where they'd gone mad. And this was the thought that haunted him through this whole period. But what he did was he tackled the situation. He began to tackle it. And he started doing yoga type exercises to quell his consciousness and to try to reach the inner material that was trying to, and try to understand what was happening to him through this inner material that was coming through. And then in August 1914, World War I broke out. And he realized that he'd been given precognitive visions of what was about to happen in Europe. And the penny dropped, and he said, finally, I understood. So he began to trust his psyche and what was being shown to him. He developed several techniques which are in use in analytical psychology now. And out of a long period of several years, he went through this destabilizing of an intellectual bent into a restructuring into an intuitive centering. And out of this is what comes as psychology. And you can actually follow this in the Red Book, which he writes about his personal journal that he kept all the way through. In his black journals first and then in his red journals, and he painted them as well. Some of the paintings are in this book. I've got 4 of the paintings from the Red Book in this, including that first vision that he had on the train. So now we've got Jung to a point where his analytical psychology starts to come through. And what he says in the book, 2 things. Maybe 3. He said, the journey from cloud cuckoo land to reality lasted a long time. In my case, Pilgrim's Progress consisted in my having to climb down 1,000 ladders until I could reach out my hand to the little clod of earth that I am. And when he was in that destabilizing period, he said, the knowledge of death came to me that night. I went into the inner death, and I saw that outer dying is better than inner death. And I decided to die outside and live within. So this is that whole period for him. Now, he also says, it has taken me virtually 45 years to distill within the vessel of my scientific work the things I experienced and wrote down at that time. That was the primal stuff which compelled me to work on it. It was the prime material for a lifetime's work. So, Jung experienced everything. Now, central to the psychology that he brought out on a personal level is the coming to wholeness in ourselves. That's a word that he uses all the time. And this wholeness in ourselves is actually a psychological path to the spiritual that he brought out. And if we engage with that, because it often comes upon us at a time where we're stagnated, our life becomes frozen, there's a huge loss, the rug is being torn from under us, something is destabilizing our life or freezing it. So this is often the time to start looking at what's happening underneath what's happening. And that's what psychology actually is. It's seeing through to what's happening behind what's happening. So with this wholeness, if we engage with it, he nominated it as the individuation process, this movement into the very centering of ourselves. And in order to get there, there are certain stages that have to be gone through. So the first one is, in Jungian terms, meeting with our shadow self. And this shadow is what we don't like about ourselves, what we don't want to know about ourselves, what we don't know about ourselves, and what we often project onto people that we dislike. On the other side, because Jung always has 2 sides, he always has this huge range. On the other side, there is the positive shadow, the parts of ourselves that haven't been developed yet, maybe gifts that we have or characteristics that we haven't brought into focus yet and that we need to develop. And often they're things that we also project onto other people, usually hero figures. So this aspect needs to be met with, acknowledged and worked with. That's stage one. He called that the apprenticeship stage. And here's what he had to say about himself in terms of shadow. My shadow is indeed so huge that I could not possibly overlook it in the plan of my life. In fact, I had to see it as an essential part of my personality, accept the consequences of this realization and take responsibility for them. Many bitter circumstances have forced me to see that though the sin one has committed or is can be regretted, it is not cancelled out. I don't believe in the tiger who was finally converted to vegetarianism and ate only apples. My solace was always St. Paul, who did not deem it beneath his dignity to admit he bore a thorn in his flesh. So he's in there with it himself. And he calls this the apprenticeship stage. The next stage, which is coming to meet and deal with and bring together into balance the inner gender energy in ourselves. So in a woman, it's an animus figure, a male figure within every woman. And in a male, it's the anima figure, the feminine within him. And this figure often appears in dreams. We often project it onto a parent figure or onto a partner. So in relationship, we're actually dealing with often the inner part of ourselves, and the partner is equally dealing with the inner part of themselves in relationship as well. So with the woman, if we actually get to know and enliven this animus in ourselves, it brings us an inner fortitude and organizing capacity to bring things through our creative and spiritual selves. In a male, it's mostly to do with relationship, and the feminine in the male is meeting with eros and meeting with the inner psyche as a reality. So anima and animus have to be dealt with. Now in Jung's life, he obviously had considerable work to do on the anima figure, because he started off at an early stage of life due to his mother's illness in distrusting women, because she was sometimes off in institutions and wasn't there, and so he was farmed out to relatives to bring up. So he developed a distrust of women, which he later had to reverse in his life. He also had married Emma Rauschenbach, and accompanying him through his destabilizing period was a woman who actually helped him as colleague and friend, Toni Wolff. And she remained in close, open relationship with him for 40 years, parallel to his marriage. Then most of his patients, or many of his patients, were women. So in dealing with women patients, of course, he's learning about the anima. So he had a lot to learn. And he does credit, in developing his psychology, he credits his patients from whom he learned a lot, especially his women's patients. So he brought through a feminine aspect, a feminine energy into psychology. Now, those are the first two stages. Once they're actually worked with and brought together, this comes into being. And this reconciling third is the centering of ourselves. There are two things that he wanted people to know about the individuation process. This wholeness that he spoke of was not perfection. Perfection he saw as a masculine concept. Wholeness he saw as a feminine one. So it's a bringing to completion in ourselves at a personal level. There's another thing that goes with Jung, and that's the term universal. So there's wholeness and universal. And with the universal, you now have to look at the deeper parts of the psyche that he encountered in his breakdown breakthrough period, in which he encountered archetypal figures who were at the objective part of the psyche, deep in and living their own ways of being. And he engaged with them. He had a passionate need to understand, and he says this is the driving power of his life. And in trying to understand what was happening at a deep level of the psyche, he actually codified it. And so he talked about myths as being dramatizations of the underlying archetypes. The myths are psychic processes. The underlying archetypes are basic primal patterns of mankind, an imprint which imply an imprinter. And then the myths arising from the archetypes together form the collective unconscious. So there are three principal things in which he has mapped the deeper levels of the psyche. And in this is where you meet the universal aspects of Jung, because he brought through material that he found when he started looking at worldwide cultures, that they were represented in those cultures in their different ways. And he also found that he had people who had dealt with the same kind of material that he was, with the Gnostics, with the alchemists, and then with the Chinese Taoists, who there was a book that he was sent from China, which he said confirmed the book of the Golden Flower, which confirmed, gave him undreamt of confirmation of his ideas. So they're the two main levels. Now, with his patients, one of the things that Jung defined as an illness of our time, he said the illness for his patients, just about all of them past 35, was spiritual suppression. And he said none of them is really cured until they have regained a religious attitude, which naturally has nothing to do with creeds or belonging to a church. The decisive question for man is he related to something infinite or not? That is the telling question of his life. Only if we know that the thing which truly matters is the infinite can we avoid fixing our interests upon futilities and upon all kinds of goals which are not of real importance. If we understand and feel that here in this life we already have a link with the infinite, desires and attitudes change. In the final analysis, we count for something only because of the essential we embody. And if we do not embody that, life is wasted. Now, Jung had a second initiation at the age of 69. And an important thing about him is he grew all his life. And you can see that particularly in the letters, which I've used extensively in the book. And this growing continued with this near-death experience when he had a heart attack in 1944 at the age of 69. And he found himself having near-death experience, and a mystic marriage took place within him at 3 different levels. One was at the Judaic-Kabbalistic level, another was at the Christian level, marriage of the Lamb, and the third one was at the Greek mythic level. And he said he found himself in states of being where past, present and future are one. And where he said the little finger knows itself to be a member of the hand. So this had a profound effect on him, and it gave him the courage to go deeper in the works that he was publishing, and to come up with some of his he says a great many of my principal works were written after that near-death experience.